Thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to the Fireside Chat. Can AI predictions be made free from bias? So my name's Tom. I'm an innovation consultant at BT. I'm going to be facilitating this session. So can I just please remind the audience that there is a chat Q&A function for this session. So please do submit any questions you might have to our speakers. So as this is a very short and important session, I'm going to hand straight over to our speakers to introduce themselves, please. Kakia.
Oh, hello, everybody, and welcome to the afternoon sessions of the festival. It's really a pleasure to be here amongst you. My name is Dr. Kakia Chatsiou. I am a Senior Research Officer at the ESRC Business and Local Government Data Research Centre at the University of Essex. I have been doing research in the area of data science and artificial intelligence, and in particular focusing with text and natural language processing for the past 10 years or so. My research focuses on automated quantitative methods for processing large amounts of textual data, and I specialize in political text and social media data, and I use a specific group of machine learning algorithms called neural networks, or as some of you might have heard being called today, deep learning. So that's me, and thanks very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Charles.
So yeah, thank you very much. I'm Charles Radcliffe. I am a partner at a firm called Ethics Grade, which I started last year to evaluate companies' use of AI and the governance they've got around it. My background, I've just completing 3 years as a visiting fellow at the University of Bristol. And in my former roles, I was the head of technology for Deutsche Bank's innovation function in London. And then more recently, I was the head of AI at Fidelity, which is a large pensions and investments firm. So for me, my focus of all my work is really on looking at governance most holistically as an organization so that we can start to draw comparisons between firms. So we can compare Tesla against Toyota or Alibaba against Amazon. And also to work with corporates to help them understand how they compare against their peer group when it comes to putting the governance in place.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then over to yourself, Mark.
My name is Mark Lattimer. I'm the director of Ceasefire, the Centre for Civilian Rights, and we're an NGO which works in conflict zones around the world to support civilians to monitor violations, so human rights violations or violations of the laws of war.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to kick this session off by just quickly asking, what exactly is bias in AI, and what are some of its major issues? Who'd like to take that?
I could go ahead with what I understand from a research point of view, and then the colleagues could join as well. So for me, algorithmic bias describes systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that would create unfair outcomes for the users of that system. And that could be, so for example, privileging certain groups or arbitrarily choosing one group over the others. It could be because of data, it could be because of how the algorithm is designed, but it could be because of other things such as societal biases that are inherent in how we understand and perceive the world that we don't realize are there, but they are there. So that's my definition, my working definition.
I think that's really interesting and perhaps a very usable definition. I just think from our point of view, where we're using AI to try and look at certain trends or patterns, I think it's just worth pointing out that it seems to me from a non-expert point of view that all research activity and certainly all AI is about trying to discover or trying to generate weightings or trends or patterns in data. And bias is the word we kind of use for those weightings where they are perceived to be negative or where we don't like them. But that it's a little bit, it's important to recognize that you can't ever do anything with data, and certainly you can't manipulate data without creating new trends or patterns that some of which are going to be negative.
Yeah, I would maybe underline what Mark has said. I would say that there's good bias and there's bad bias, and in my line of work, bias is our friend because we are very much trying to evaluate different issues and different values against each other. And so we are inherently weighting certain things over other things, and we are therefore bringing a bias to bear, and obviously making sure that we're automating our process. We're therefore designing AI systems that are inherently biased by design. But I think the problem really comes from bias is when we have unintended bias creeping into a system, so that one group of people are prejudiced over another group of people, and that was not an intended consequence of the design of the system. But I'd also maybe just want to take a step back, that really the big problem with AI systems that we are going to face over the coming years is not really a question simply of bias or indeed a question of fairness. It's about a question of how appropriate those systems are and how aligned those systems are to our values. And I can absolutely imagine a scenario where a system is fully aligned to our values. It's also been designed in such a way that it's unbiased, but it's not fair. And I think we've got to keep in mind, the looking at technical debiasing techniques in the context of also making sure that the solutions we're building are appropriate and fit for purpose.
Fantastic, thank you very much. We're also joined by John Chamberlin now, so thank you for joining us, John. We've just kicked off the session. I'm going to throw this question to you, John, if that's okay. So, based on our conversation of what exactly is bias in AI, so should all opinions be treated equally then, or should we intentionally bias our own AI systems towards opinions or votes that are more informed and more trustworthy?
That's great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, apologies for my slight late arrival. Traffic was terrible getting here. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Essex, and I study collective intelligence systems. And part of that, you may have heard it also called crowdsourcing. And part of the systems we develop basically take opinions from people, interpretations about tasks that we put forward. And when we analyze that data, what we find is that if you treat everyone's interpretation or vote or opinion equally, then the performance that you get from the algorithms that we use, the models, is not as good as if you weight the opinions based on the person's ability to answer the question, but also the how difficult the question is in the first place, and how often that question comes up within all of the questions that you look at. So we look at tasks specifically, and how you can answer those tasks using AI. And obviously we use AI in much more complicated ways than that. But certainly from our field where we work, is that we would never take a majority vote. That's definitely the most naive way we could do things. If 10 people tell us one thing and one person says another, we would believe the 10 people, not the one person, if we used majority voting. But it might be that one person knows something that the other 10 don't. So we need to, AI is very useful for understanding what that one person knows and whether to believe that one person over the 10 people. But of course, now you have 10 people who are upset because they haven't been listened to. So yeah, as Charles was saying, bias can be good and bad, and obviously unintended bias or bias that makes things unfair disadvantages certain people, and we should try and align our systems so that we don't do that. But again, we also need to understand that some people's opinions and interpretations are more valuable than others in the context of answering a question or solving a task.
I think that's right, and I think one of the most important things there is transparency. You have to explain and be transparent about what you're doing, because if you ever hear someone saying, our system is not biased, or our system has no biases, or we have eliminated bias in the system, I think it's at that point that you need to actually become suspicious. Because if it wasn't in the business of trying to generate bias, why would they use the system? I mean, it seems to me that we need to be just a little bit more open about the fact that all of us are trying to look for patterns or trends. We're trying to generate weightings. We're trying to manipulate data in order to achieve an outcome. And this attempt to say, oh, well, we have a system which has no bias, is actually, it's either ill-informed or it's disingenuous.
I agree, and I think there's a very good question in the chat asking, is there such a thing as such as objective decision making? And I think we need to sort of consider what fairness means as well. So what do we mean by fair, and how we actually teach the machine what fairness is, and what we mean by good and ethical objective decision making. And that's where the explainability systems come into place. I mean, the previous Fire Chat was very helpful in terms of outlining the details around that.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, I'm just looking at some of the other questions that have come in, which are really interesting. There's this suggestion that maybe AI would be more objective because it's somehow an automated process or a robotic process rather than more human interaction. And in fact, sometimes what you're using, I think, AI for is actually to discover or to weight those human voices, the sort of crowdsourcing that John was talking about, and weight some voices over others. So it's not like you're replacing human interaction or human opinions with automation or technology. It's more that you're actually deliberately weighting some opinions more than others in order to achieve a positive result.
I would just maybe add a few things to that. I think we use the term decision making quite liberally in the AI industry. But when we talk about decision making, what we're really talking about generally is there's a higher probability of a certain label being correct to another label. So when a machine looks at images of cats and determines whether something is a cat or not a cat, it's a probabilistic match. It's not making a decision in a kind of human sense of the word. It's simply a probability matching. And so I think when we use the term decision, we kind of collapse everything from complex decisions in terms of how do we rebuild our economy post-pandemic as a decision or set of decisions that might be made, all the way down to deciding whether something's a cat in a picture. And obviously what machines do is the more trivial end of that spectrum. And so I think we can talk in terms of an objective process, in the terms that there's no emotional connection in that weighting that decision. But what we are talking about is something which is as cold as it is, it's a very strong form of leverage. And if we think about technology in general being just all about leverage, all the way from the first humanoids that picked up sticks and realized they could make good levers, all the way through to supercomputers and quantum technology and AI, what we've got is leverage in our hands. And unfortunately, that leverage is immensely powerful in this interconnected world, because it can impact tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people in an instant. So the leverage is far-reaching, and also at the same time, the impact that it can have can be quite extreme. And so objective decision making might sound, as a couple of words put together, quite unoffensive. But when something small goes wrong, as the case is with leverage, the consequences can be quite devastating.
Yes, and I think you have to also realize that you can achieve a good outcome. You can create an algorithm or produce an effect in the real world which is undeniably positive, but in the course of that movement, you're creating side effects which may be negative. And I think that's why it's so important to have transparency and to also think about the ethical principles by which AI is going to be regulated. But it seems to me to be an openness about those objectives, and about the way in which you achieve that outcome has to be central.
I think one of the important things about AI going forward is the acceptance of AI, and I agree with you, Mark, that the transparency is key to that. But whether and also explainability of AI decisions. But AI, as you were saying, Charles, is trying to get to be an objective decision maker. but humans aren't objective. We have opinions and we have emotions, and if we try and get an AI to not be like that, would we ever accept it? Would we ever accept and acquiesce to the decisions that are made on our behalf? In particular, if they are high stakes decisions, so who do we save in the hospital? Because all the beds are full. Those kind of things. Well, this person has a higher lifespan. This person might respond better to treatment. In those kind of environments, humans are not willing to acquiesce to AI, I don't think. But I guess that's one of the biggest problems, and transparency, and knowing that the decision is not because your friend knows someone and that's why the decision was made, and it is based on something fair. I think is definitely the way forward.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting point, John. I think something I looked at many years ago in my work was something which I call human touch, meaning when you look at a role that you might want to automate, rather than looking about which parts of the role lend themselves to technology automating, you should flip the idea on its head and consider which elements of the role are undesirable to automate because the human touch aspect of it is too important. And I think there's not enough work really done in this field to look at the consequences of automation or decision making, and say this decision making ought to be done by a human because humans are going to accept the result better. But I think just back to the last year, when we saw the what was it called, the mutant algorithm that wasn't really mutated at all, but it was just a very bad example of technology being applied to solving a problem with exam results. I think what we all learn from that is that unfair potentially decisions are better accepted from humans making those decisions than the cold objective decision making that a machine might apply. Why is that? I think there's two reasons. One, because the machine is going to amplify pre-existing bias, but also I think there's a very human aspect to this. I think if you're being given a decision by that's going to impact your life at the either beginning of your life when you're looking at your future education, or the end of your life when you're looking at terminal care or something in between, I think those really life-changing decisions are much better communicated and made by humans than by machines. But that's my personal opinion, and what we really need is a bit more debate on those questions. And I think we need a lot more debate on what aspects of human touch should we maybe guardrail from technology encroaching on too much.
Yes, and I think that's really interesting. And from our point of view, we're often looking at quite old-fashioned human effort and human interaction to regulate and repair some of the unforeseen side effects that we get from machine learning or from AI. So, for example, in our monitoring abuses, working with the colleagues at Essex University, we're looking at social media streams and using natural language processing to identify human rights violations or violations of the laws of war, the targeting of civilians. But you have to distinguish that from ordinary societal violence. So, say car accidents or a fight or something like that, or even metaphorical violence. Baghdad Rovers slaughtered us in the match last night. But we found that because you're identifying political violence, social violence of a particular kind, it tended to underweight violence against women, which is often regulated to the private sphere. So we had to make sure that we had extra efforts from researchers on the ground, from monitors, to identify specific violations that were underweighted through the results of the algorithms.
I wouldn't agree more. And to take us back to the question of the Fire Chat, I mean, can AI-based prediction be made free of bias? I think we can never underestimate the importance of how complex this is to address. This is not just a technical problem that requires a technical solution. This is not just a question or a problem about people and beliefs and morals. It's both, and even more, because we have an internet bias as well. So for me, in addition to the transparency, accountability, using open data, understanding as a citizen, as a person, what the algorithm does and how it makes a decision, is also important to sort of upskill everybody to be able to understand. Both so numerical and digital skills upskilling, I think, is also a very important aspect of this problem. I don't know if people have different opinions, but I think that's kind of an understated area of that problem as well.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have now run out of time. That's absolutely flown by. It's been a really brilliant session, I think. There's some very, very important points raised there. So I just want to thank you all very, very much for your time today. I hope everyone that's joined the session has found it very engaging. I know I have. So just want to remind everyone about the next session that we've got today. It is another AI challenge game. So please do go ahead and click on the next session. But once again, thank you very much to all of our panelists, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.